You understand? That by itself wouldn't carry the weight. But what carries the weight is in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when the Sahaba, for example, were praying in the direction of in the direction of Jerusalem, and the order came from one individual coming into the masjid and telling them the Qibla has been changed to Mecca, and they all turned into prayer. They didn't refuse because it was only one person telling them. Or when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen and told them to inform them that Allah was one, right? That those people would accept this. They didn't question and ask, well, bring some other proof along with it. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sent individual messengers on numerous occasions, meaning that that individual messenger was sufficient. As long as he's a reliable, established individual in the community, is known, etc., is a reliable narrator, then his evidence is sufficient. So that which took place in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, with his approval or with his instruction, stands as clear evidence. What happened afterwards, because you have both sides, that's not as strong in evidence, right?
Is there any...
I don't want to go into too many questions. Now let's finish the presentation, then we go into the questions. The other point to note, that in the time of the companions, if companions were found to practice, or they're involved in instructions of the Prophet ﷺ, which were abrogated, and they continued to practice it, they were instructed to give these practices up. If those who had information on its abrogation, that was given precedence over those who didn't. So, and of course, whenever the evidence was brought to people, then they would back down from it. So, as a general principle, where the companions may have had different opinions, in general they would respect these differences. These differences may have been in fiqh, or they may even have been in aqidah, because some people think that the differences are only in fiqh and they didn't come into aqidah. So that's where we can tolerate differences of opinion in fiqh, but we can't tolerate them in aqidah. The aqidah has to be only one. Of course, this is an idealistic look. Reality is that when you go even into the field of aqidah, you will find differences of opinion with regards to the Sahaba on certain issues, which are not clarified with, the clearest of evidences. For example, did Prophet Muhammad ﷺ go into the heavens by his spirit, or his spirit and his body? Companions differed on it. Did Prophet Muhammad ﷺ see Allah, or did he not when he was on Isra and Mi'raj? Was it something special given to him or not? Because there are verses which imply that he did. But I'm saying that where such opinions were held, the companions not having clear other evidence would accept their opinions. Where clear evidence was found and brought, then those arguments ended. But where no clear evidence was available, is not to say that evidence was not left behind, because we don't necessarily look back at their differences and said, okay, they differed there, so it's okay for us to differ. No, because they differed based on the information that was available to them. Later on, additional information may have come to strengthen one side over the other, and we now are required to follow where the additional evidence is, not just going on the fact that they differed and say, okay, it's okay to differ. So the point is that where there wasn't sufficient evidence to clarify one side or the other, they allowed those differences, and they didn't allow those differences to split their ranks. But where they found clear evidence to the contrary, then they were strong with it, and they brought it across and took those who opposed it, to task. As Umar ibn Khattab, when he heard, word came to him that some people were still practicing mut'ah, or temporary marriage, which was allowed as a marriage form in the early part of Islam and then later prohibited by the Prophet ﷺ, he threatened with lashes anyone who was caught still practicing it, right? So, if we notice as a general feature or a general characteristic of the fiqh of this period, it's that the factionalism didn't take place. Now, why was there an absence of factionalism? We see because they maintained unity amongst themselves, following a variety of different principles. Among them, as a principle to preserve their unity, was mutual consultation, or shura. That the caliph would rely on the shura to come to decisions. It was rare that he would override their decisions. Most commonly, he accepted their decisions, and they represented the various opinions in the community, and which were of valid opinions, which were worth putting forward. Because of course, you will always find people differing. You always find other opinions wherever you go on every issue, right? But ones which could be considered. Secondly, in the time of the righteous caliphs, because many of the leading Sahaba were still in the centers of Islam, they were kept there, then arriving at a consensus was relatively easy. Later on, when the central nature of the caliphate didn't keep around it the majority of the leading scholars amongst the companions, etc., and their students, where these people spread, and we'll look at the reasons why later on, then arriving at a consensus became difficult. And that's why you have the statement of Ahmed ibn Hanbal, who only recognized ijma' or consensus up until the end of the time of the Sahaba. His position is that whoever claims ijma' after the times of the Sahaba are liars. That's how he expressed it. Of course, he didn't necessarily mean literally that people were liars, but it was not true. Something that you really couldn't establish. And for sure you will find some scholars somewhere differing with them. Right? Thirdly, what we find when we look at the various rulings made by the Sahaba, that the vast majority of them didn't make rulings. When they were asked to give a fatwa, they would pass it on to another, till it reached the leading companions, like the four Abdullahs. They call them Al-Abadila Al-Arba'a, the four Abdullahs, right? That was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, and Abdullah ibn Umar. These are the four Abdullahs. They came to be known as Ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, as opposed to call them Abdullah, because of course each one was Abdullah, right? Anyway, that was the nature of the companions. For fear of giving wrong rulings, they were very reluctant to give rulings. They passed it on to those who they knew to be more versed, or more they're having more capabilities, or whatever, however they judged it, that they were more capable than themselves, they would pass it on. Fourthly, what we find in that period is that the narration of hadith was not as frequent. There was narration going on according to need, but the narrations were limited. So when you look at the Sahaba who narrated hadith, you'll find them congregated among the top 10. The vast majority, we'd say about 80% of the hadith, were narrated by the top 10 or 15 companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And when you go beyond that, you see the numbers dropping very rapidly. So narration tended to be found among in certain group amongst the Sahaba, especially the leading scholars among them. And that was due partly to their fear of misquoting the Prophet ﷺ, who had warned them in the Hadith found in Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, whoever tells a lie in my name will find his seat in the hellfire. So for fear of misquoting the Prophet ﷺ, they were very reluctant to narrate Hadith, unless they were just absolutely certain. Right? No one else knew it. So they would narrate it. Also, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab himself, in his time, had ordered the companions to concentrate on the narration and the study of the Qur'an, and to minimize the narration of Hadith in his period. Because what was available was sufficient to handle the issues, new issues that didn't really manifest themselves as much in his time as they did in the time of Uthman ibn Affan. This is when they started to manifest in large numbers, where that rule or that principle which was established by Umar ibn al-Khattab was dropped. So if we are to look at the general characteristics, we say, of fiqh during this period, we'd have to say that the fiqh of this period was, for the most part, what we would call realistic fiqh, or fiqh waqi'i. It dealt with existing problems. They did not get into hypothetical, theoretical issues. What if? That developed later on. Basically, the fiqh addressed the problems of their times. As in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the Qur'an, its Sunnah, revealed to address the issues of the time. But at the same time, there's still Qur'an and Sunnah which addressed times to come. Because if we consider the ruling that we use concerning what to do for prayer when we have 6 months of daylight and 6 months of night. Right? As you go closer to the Arctic Circle, you reach a point where you have 6 months of daylight, the light shines, sun shines 24 hours a day for 6 months. Then 24 hours of night where there's no sun at all for 6 months. Yeah. You didn't know that?
I knew.
Yeah. There are places in the north, in Alaska, the north, northern parts of Canada, it's there, northern parts of Russia, it's there, up in the north of Norwegian, Scandinavia, the upper parts, you find that. So that exists. So what to do at that time? Right? How do you calculate your prayers? How are they supposed to fast? No, it's the same thing. Same thing. How do you fast? How do you calculate your prayers? Because you got 6 months. You got 6 months of daylight. So your day is now 6 months long. Right? You pray once every what? Every month, right? Month and a half, or a month and a sixth. Right? No. I mean, what you do? What you do is you have to calculate based on what? Some scholars say you calculate based on the nearest country to you, or nearest region which has a daily night and a day. You have a sunset every day and a sunrise. So the nearest country to you, whatever their timing is, you go by that. Others say, well, you go by the timing of Mecca. Just choose Mecca, finish. Timing of Mecca, that's what you calculate by. So the issue of what you calculate by is, the scholars have varied in their opinions. Why? Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had just said, calculate it, estimate it. He said, estimate it. قدروا. Now what was the circumstance They didn't experience that. What was the circumstance in which the Prophet ﷺ told his companions who would not experience that?
Experience the time of the Dajjal.
Yes, exactly. When he was speaking about the time to come. So here is fiqh, which was not waqi', right? It was not dealing with the exact circumstance, but it was fiqh of a time to come. When he told them that the first year of Dajjal's rule, the first day of Dajjal's rule would be like a year. It would last for 1 year, first day. And the first question the Sahaba asked him was, how are we going to pray? That was their main concern. How are we going to pray? And he told them, estimate it. So he left the principle 1,400 years ago, how to deal with prayer in the time now where we have people, Muslims living in these lands where you have 6 months of day and 6 months of night. So fasting is the same principle. You calculate where sunrise would be and sunset, and you fast accordingly. So we could say that that is one of the distinguishing characteristics of that era. That fiqh dealt with the issues that the companions, the leading companions, were faced with. Secondly, the companions who led the ummah did not prescribe a methodology. They didn't set their rulings in stone. So they set a set of codes, for example, which then became fixed, which would create other opinions, and others would want to set alternative or contrary codes, and when they died, others you'd have 2 factions or 3 factions or whatever would appear. No, what they did is they made the rulings in their time. Abu Bakr made his rulings when Umar ibn al-Khattab became the leader of the ummah. Then he made his rulings. Some of them agreed with those of Abu Bakr, some of them superseded those of Abu Bakr. Another characteristic of fiqh of that era was the general position of what we call literalism, or what has been called literalism, where the obvious meaning of texts were favored. What you find is that the caliphs and those under them, the leading scholars, generally speaking, used to follow the obvious meanings of the various texts whenever they came. They had a decision to make. They did not go into metaphor and simile and try to reinterpret texts, but they tended to follow the obvious meaning and avoid personal opinions, because of course this is where you're going to start to get a variety of opinions coming up, where personal opinions arise. Not to say that there wasn't to some degree some personal opinions which were expressed, and for example Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who represented the school of thought whereby they would seek to understand the principles behind rulings and as such express opinions which may differ from the obvious text, but what they felt it implied. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud did take this position. So the beginnings of what they call Ahlul Ra'i, or the reasoning approach to the legal texts, the seeds were there from that time. But as a dominant feature, the companions generally followed the obvious meanings of the text. What we find also in this period is that the companions did suspend some elements of the Sharia based on its, you could say, non-relevance to their time. Not that it would never have relevance, so they were cancelling it, but they were suspending it because the major reasons for it were no longer present at their time. And the well-known example of giving in the time of Umar ibn Khattab, the practice of giving cash gifts from the central treasury to the newly converted Muslims. This is from the Bayt al-Mal. This practice Umar ibn Khattab stopped. You know, this is from, which is coming from the zakah. Mu'allafat al-qulub, winning over hearts of those who newly converted to help them stabilize them in Islam, etc. He ruled that this was not really necessary anymore. Islam was already established, fully established. We don't need to win over hearts anymore. The state is expanding, it's strong. So he suspended that category and diverted its funds to other categories. Not that the zakah itself actually stopped, but the zakah continued to be collected, but whatever was collected was divided up amongst the other elements, or the other heads of expenditure. The fifth and last major characteristic of fiqh of that era is that it was a unified fiqh, in that the head of the madhab was the head of the state. So basically in the time of Abu Bakr, it was the Abu Bakr madhab. Time of Umar, it was the Umar madhab, Uthmanic madhab, and the Ali madhab, right? Alawi madhab. You could say in each era, they were the leading scholar,